Thank you so much. So we're going to break all precedent and start before 5:05 and get this show to roll. So Kelly, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Welcome everybody. Hold on, I wasn't quite ready. Just okay. The normal Zoom, as we all know. If all the work group members could just type your name in the chat box for attendance, that would be great. Otherwise, just please remember to mute yourself when you're not talking. You can use the chat function, raise your hands. However, to get our attention during the meeting, and this meeting is being recorded. Aaron?
Now I will unmute. So welcome to introductions. So I'm Aaron Bass. I am co-chair of the settlement committee. I'll let Chuck introduce himself. You're on, Chuck?
Yep. Can't hear me?
I'll introduce Chuck. So Chuck is the co-chair of the settlement committee as well. Now we can hear you, Chuck. You're unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yep. Thanks.
So anything you want to say, Chuck?
No, just welcome. Happy New Year.
Perfect. Happy New Year. And anytime anyone wants to speak and they are muted, you owe $5 to an educational cause of your choice. So we'll make that an unofficial rule. So we'll just go down the list of all of the committee members. So I'll go from my top and I'll start off with Shelly and we'll just jump in, not over.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Shelley Rouser. Pleased to see everybody again, and I am the chairperson for education programs at Delaware State University.
Dr. Henry.
Hello, everybody. Gary Henry. I'm the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Delaware.
I did say jump in, not over, and I'm gonna just make it go faster, and I'll go down my list. So Sarah Stowens.
Hi, everyone. This is my first meeting. I'm excited to join you all. I'm here from Rodell.
Perfect. Let me jump down some more. Kristen.
Hi, folks. Kristen Dwyer with the Delaware State Education Association.
Perfect. And then Rashawn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rashawn Austin. I'm an education associate with the Delaware Department of Ed. I work primarily with diverse educator recruitment and retention.
Perfect. And closing out with Monique.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Monique Martin, and I serve in the Office of Equity and Innovation at the Delaware Department of Education. My focus is equity. Good to see everyone again.
Perfect. And I'll go to co-chair Matt Den of the Reading Consortium.
Oh, I think you just introduced me. I have nothing to add.
Perfect. And then I will go to Susan, special guest.
I didn't think I was going to be called on because I'm not an official member, but I am asked to join you when I can. I'm the Secretary of Ed, and it's good to see you all working for the betterment of students in our state.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. So we'll move to the meeting minutes. I'll let Kelly take this part.
So you all should have received the meeting minutes prior. I sent them out earlier this week. If anybody has any changes, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm looking for a motion to approve. Don't all jump at once.
So moved.
And second, anybody?
Second.
All in favor, thumbs up.
Aye.
Awesome. Thank you.
Chuck, take it away.
All right, goals today is to look at our way ahead, see what we're going to do this school year, this fiscal year. Take a quick look at legislation, nothing new, but we'll just go over what we have on our list. Talk about the independent funding assessment RFP timeline. Some Delaware funding system issues. I think we also didn't make this list, but I think we have something about the ombudsman RFP in here too. And we'll take public comment at the end. Next slide, please. All right, so to talk about legislation, this is stuff from last session. We had the opportunity funding bill, K-3 basic special education. We have House Bill 100, mental health services unit. These are all great things. Doing a lot of good stuff for kids with these, with the results of these bills. And then we also had the concurrent HCR 24 for modernizing Delaware's education funding system. Something that's not on this list that, you know, and I'd looked at this and I just didn't think to put this on here is the state budget. Every year the state budget comes out, and that in itself is legislation. If you look at the epilogue to this current year, fiscal year 22 state budget, you'll see lots of references to funding settlement, to Reading Consortium in there. So they're all sprinkled throughout. To find that, go toward the end of the budget bill and look in the education section of the epilogue and just go through there, and you'll see lots of things. So, all right. And then we have next, I think we're going to,
so if we can go from this, if we can go to 8.
Okay.
They want to have Shannon be here, and then we'll come back to slide 7 with the ombudsperson update.
Okay, here is our chart. I love this chart that that UDIPA put together for us. I'm just going to intro. I think I intro this, and then Kelly gives us more detail. Is that right? No, that's what it says on the note here that I have. So that's okay. I can give a little more detail on this. What we do is year by year, we're highlighting fiscal year 2023 on this now. These are the things that we expect to see in next year's budget bill, or based on this year's legislation or this year's legislation. So starting with opportunity funding, we did see an increase. Actually, it exceeded this amount. It exceeded the 35 and 5. I think it's actually 38 and 5, something like that, for this next year. So that's already in place. That's a go. I think the new feature that pops into place for 2023 is that the funding has to be targeted to the schools that generate that. So in Aaron's case, it's pretty easy. He just targets it all to his own one school. In a case like Christina, where we have, a couple dozen schools, we have already been trying to align the money toward the schools that generate them, but just to be ready for that when it comes. So that's something to look out for. The next row, K-3 basic special education, you remember in the legislation slide that's already in place. So we are receiving some units this year for K-3 basic special education. So that's actually ahead. Next slide, please. So early education, there's money in for early education, additional money. I know that there's a grant application that was sent out for some early education initiatives. Teacher recruitment and retention there is a statement in the budget bill just acknowledging that it's an intent statement is what I call it, for the $4 million teacher recruitment and retention for next year. Ombudsperson, where that is right now is it's funded at $1 million. Personally, I don't think that's enough to do the job. Say that straight up, but there's an RFP out now. It went out before, and it came back out for, maybe to cast a wider net or a different net. I'm not sure, exactly what's behind that, but it is out right now. It is active. So if you're listening or you listen to the recording and you want to be part of the ombuds offices in the 3 counties, we encourage you to put in an RFP for that. The equity statement for capital projects is done. As we said last year, it's just quite literal. It just meets exactly what the letter of the settlement is. Nothing more than that. And independent funding assessment, what we're looking for out of that is it's supposed to be complete by January 2024. What we're looking for that for this year is that it's going to be funded. We expect to see something in maybe the governor's recommended budget, to set a funding level and a process for acquiring the services for the independent funding assessment. All right, next.
So actually, we can go, we're gonna skip around a little bit. If you go back to slide 7, because I know you touched on that, Chuck, with the ombudsperson update. And so, yes, thank you that it did go out. There were some revisions. The deal we issued on April 15th and then reissued it on September 10th. The additional scopes and the services are that it specifies disciplinary matters as including but not limited to suspensions, clarifies roles facilitating the resolution of parent-student concerns, and then adds providing ongoing support and mentorship to students after the resolution of disputes. It also adds evaluating program satisfaction by parents, guardians, and students who are recipients of the program services. And so, as Chuck mentioned, the $1 million for the budget and also have this impact the entire state. We do think there's room for increase, and that's a request of the legislature. I know Shannon's also with us, and I had some conversations with her as well as some other members. And so, Shannon, any thing you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. I think what some individuals that I've spoken with, and also a couple of legislators, as we look to recognize the importance of this office, we believe that it should really be established much more securely. And the way to do that is to have the office codified as secured through legislation. And so we're looking to have an initial meeting with some legislators that have expressed an interest in doing so. This would guarantee the independence of the office as specified and outlined in the settlement, that the agency is supposed to be independent, non-governmental and independent. Also, what is not currently listed or requested in the RFP or outlined as far as job or roles and functions is that this office can have a governance role, oversight role that's currently not there. We believe this is an opportunity to have an additional organization to help to facilitate that. That makes sure we have more family and community engagement around the decision-making tables across the state. And we also believe that it also can secure funding, because I think we all agree that $1 million is not sufficient for a statewide agency or statewide work. And so we believe that this is the way to just kind of ensure that the office, will be able to be sustained. And as far as oversight of the office, again, making sure that it is independent. One of the recommendations is that the education committees out of the House and the Senate could potentially appoint its own advisory group that would act as oversight for the office, thereby having a level of independence. So those are some of the key things that we believe can help to strengthen the office. I think, we're headed in the right direction, but I don't think, at least those who understand the importance of advocacy and having families engaged in this work and having a voice, we believe that the office is a way to do that, and we want to further strengthen what's in the RFP.
Perfect. In a lot of conversations about the ombudsperson this year, and even those that took place last year, I had a moment today where I messed up with the parent yesterday. And so I, at dismissal, went through 130 cars to find this one parent. Out of the 200 we have, she was 130 in our line. And I walked to the parent and I apologized for something that had taken place. And it was something that I'm not opposed to, because when a school or any leader messes up, we need to own up for it. Why do I bring that up? I bring it up because for an ombudsperson, we got to call it fair. And there are times where the actual institution, the LEA, the district, or even larger than that, might have messed up. And there are times that the parent and the student might be in the wrong. And truth is, we have to call it as fair as possible, make that happen, which also means we'd love to see there be some independence in this. I know that is something that could be with this new committee, and I know, so Shannon, you have some more meetings set up around this. Is that correct for the ombudsperson?
Yeah, so we have an initial conversation with Senator Lockman, Representative Chakotcha, Representative Kim Williams, and Bill Doolittle. We'll be meeting on September the 20th to discuss the potential for legislation. And we'll basically be leaning off of the framework that the Reading Consortium has already approved for the office as a starting point for that conversation. So if anyone is interested in wanting to be a part of that conversation, please let me know and I'll be happy to send you the invite as well.
Shannon, are you fine if I put your email in the chat, or Kelly, if you can put her email in the chat?
Sure, please do.
Perfect. Anybody wants to reach out? And if we think about the legislation that this settlement committee pushed forth last year, that Chuck mentioned in slide 6, it's amazing just seeing the advocacy out of this group. And so looking forward to seeing continued advocacy as we look forward to seeing children and education be improved here in the state. Shannon, thank you for that. Any questions of Shannon before we move on? Perfect. And we look forward to discussing this at our next meeting as well.
No, Aaron, I do have one question, and I could go back and forth and look, but I know that maybe it's an Aaron question. I don't know. It's maybe all of us question. The RFP did change between last time and this time. Is there any stuff that is in there now that's not necessarily part of the scope per the settlement? Is there like extra stuff? Because like I said, I'm concerned that the scope of this, as the RFP, as I read it, I was just trying to think, if I had an organization, how would I staff this? And I got to $1 million real quick without being able to provide all those services. So either Shannon, Aaron, or anybody who might have their eyes on this, is there some extra stuff in there that,
yeah, so
maybe shouldn't be part of this role? I don't know.
I'll even point to the slide that's up right now. There were 4 additional bullets that were added. Nothing was taken away from the April 15th, 2021 RFP. It was just added for September 10th. And our team here pulled out those 4 different bullets. The issue that we're looking at is how you do the mentorship and how you do the added pieces, which, again, to your point, Chuck, to do this effectively for the entire state, we do think would need additional funding. So, and I think that's also something we would love to see with the ombudsperson that is eventually selected, that they start looking at, well, how do I deal with this, as well as how do I deal with insurance? I know we discussed liability, especially with providing ongoing support and mentorship with students means direct servicing. And so there's room there that would require more funding and also be effective for the entire state. But I think you're right. There's more funding needed to meet these certain goals.
I agree 100%.
And even if you go to slide 10, just to add on to this, thank you so much, Kelly. The proposed path forward. These are things we're looking at. Just wanted to add in, we requested from John Niebauer at a previous meeting in last year about the equity dashboard. Just to update you all, we did receive word that it should be available to the public in December after some revisions. And so looking forward to that, just to call that out, that would mean that the ombudsperson group would be able to look at public data to then figure out how to also positively impact districts, LEAs, charters, impact anybody in a positive way, and also be able to be effective. So just to update path forward, we want to see that equity dashboard come out. And I've also reached back out to John just to say thank you for his communication, and we're still doing follow-up on that one. Proposed focus area that we'll also be looking at is review independent funding assessment RFP. And so Kelly emailed the draft to everybody, which has a lot of work to be done. And we recall from last year, we were in our ideating phase and finalizing the RFP for the ombudsperson, what we thought should be in it. And DOE moved at a different pace than us. And so we had conversation about how we can work better together. And so we're so happy to see Dr. Bunting here, and she's been in conversation with us. And so excited for that partnership and collaboration. And now we're looking at the independent funding assessment. Before that goes out, the big question for Delaware is, are we funding correctly? What might be changed for funding, which is a huge mega structure to look at. So we'd love to get your input and have that conversation today about that. Also, we're looking at reviewing Delaware's current funding structure, just having some ideas here. We're going to start getting that conversation today. So one is the RFP, what needs to be done to make sure we look at the funding. We also know that we have some ideas around it. Chuck and I have solved all the problems of the state of Delaware in our small conversations. And truth is, if two adults can do that, we know there's many more problems we have not even seen. So we're not taking credit. We're just saying that we all have different ideas. We'd love to start putting those out there, especially because as the independent funding assessment gets developed and gets moving forward, they'll be making recommendations, and we'd love to be able to inform our opinions and ideas around that. And then to continue monitor the settlement areas. And so Shannon brought up before about the ombudsperson. So we're looking at how do you measure success with that? And then also possible legislation so that there's independence, which I think will be helpful for DOE, will be helpful for all the LEAs, the local education agencies, and then definitely for the students, because we need more people to walk up to grown adults and say, and to the children, we messed up, we need to fix that, we need to make it right. And then we also, I've had some parents interact with me this past week and just say, you were right, what happened was wrong, and we need to fix that. And so the more transparency and honesty we can have in our state, the better we can be in making sure we have strong children moving forward. So that is the path forward. And now would love to get into discussion on slide 11, thank you, around the RFP. So you got the document in your emails. You also have the links. Thank you so much, Kelly. Would love to get into what do we need to have in this RFP? DOE, just to repeat, Dr. Bunting and her team have final say over the over the RFP. So this is not the Reading Consortium finally approves this, and then this is what is taken there, but we'd love to give input and guidance there. So let's discuss. Gary, jump on in.
Couple of preliminary questions, if I might. The two questions are, how is independent going to be defined here? I've seen lots of consulting firms that go from state to state, repeat doing the same analysis in the same way that may not fit the state context very well. And I'm afraid if we limit independence to folks who are doing this work around the country, and you can see that in the last review that I'm aware of for Delaware was funded by Rodell, and one of the major consulting firms in this area did it. And I just am not sure that would be the thorough kind of work that we're looking for. And secondly, whose draft is it that we received and have in front of us now? Aaron, I'm just not sure of, did that come from the department or where did it come from?
That came from us. And so that was trying to put together some ideas early about the independent funding assessment. There are huge holes in it, and wanted to be as transparent as possible. We wanted to have some of the thinking out there. As we look to finalize it, the plan is that our committee finalizes what this independent funding assessment looks like, the RFP. Once we approve it, then it will pass on to the Reading Consortium, have the full Reading Consortium approve it. And we're doing this much earlier because we want the timeline to be enough time for DOE to receive that. We have conversations with them. They have final say over what goes into that because it's their RFP, but we'd love to have input ahead of time. So that's the answer to that second question. The first question, You are correct. And so right now with the ideation phase, would love to hear what you think we should put in for independence so we can also capture that as well and discuss it in this group. Did I lose you, Gary?
No, I'm here.
Perfect. So what would you like to see put in place for independence?
I'm not quite sure that I can formulate exactly, but I don't know how whether or not UD, Del State, other institutions would be considered independent, other entities in the state that might be able to do this work and have the solid set of researchers who are familiar with this kind of work and who do it, contribute to it in other states. And I guess I'm a little bit concerned that if the narrow definition of independent means they need to come from out of state, then I think that could restrict us to the usual band of consultants. So if it's indeed the decisions made that the universities, institutions, and think tanks in Delaware should be excluded from this for some reason, then I think that we should truly try to seek academic institutions that might do a more tailored job of this, as well as consultants and consulting firms that may be interested in the work. I don't know if IPA has the kind of resources and interest to do this work, but I'm a little bit concerned that the definition of independent will be written so that it's not the independence of the researchers, but independence from the state in a certain way, and may give us folks who are less likely to tailor the work to what the state really needs.
Love it. And also the chat is blowing up, so I love that too. Chuck, did you want to hit your comment about what was in the settlement?
Yes, I took a quick look in the settlement itself. Verbatim, it says, the assessment shall be done by an organization that is independent of the state. So whatever the procurement definition of that is, that's what they'll have to go by. So yeah, it doesn't really nail it. I would think that, so if I were the procurement agent in charge of this RFP, I would probably interpret this that UD Del State could not be the independent funding assessment vendor. Yeah, so that's, it just depends on how the procurement people will interpret that, or how that RFP is written. But I also, I am sympathetic, very sympathetic to something that Dean Henry said, and that's, I don't want it to be an organization that just does this for everybody, and we get like a 75-page report where it's exactly the same as Indiana's report, at least the first 73 pages. And then you get 2 pages of Delaware, and then the last paragraph always says other more research is needed in the subject, right? So I just don't want it to be us to get somebody else's canned stuff. It really should. I don't know, when they specify it, they probably should say something like 75% of the report or more must be specific to Delaware. I don't know. That's just one recommendation. I don't know, that percentage is very arbitrary, but those are just two thoughts. So, I'm not saying that UD or Del State or anybody would not do a good job, but the settlement is pretty, it looks like it's written pretty clearly on that.
Well, I guess, Chuck, maybe that's clear to you. It's probably clear as mud to me, because it says
understood
independent of the state. And so does that mean the state agency? Does that mean no one from the state of Delaware could be involved? So let's just take a very broad hypothetical that an independent organization in the state decides to reach out to technical experts and put a proposal in. Is that appropriate? I mean, will that be deemed independent of the state? I think it's a lot murkier than what's implied just because of the language of the settlement. And so I do believe that we should consider putting forward a recommendation about the interpretation of that language, or we should seek an interpretation from whoever would provide that in the state, whether it's the procurement office or whatever, just so we know what we're working with. Because if you look at the way most of these consulting firms work, they make the assumption that there are 2 or 3 scenarios of adequate funding and assumptions that will be made, and then they run out based on what adequate funding would look like, a couple of scenarios, and that's kind of what you're left with at the end of the day. And I personally believe we should be advocating for a continuous ongoing process like Maryland has, where this is updated every 2 or 3 years, and that rather than getting so far behind in where we are and making these changes, that we have a constant flow or regular routine flow of information about our funding system that allows us to make incremental corrections rather than waiting for a suit to make corrections that would benefit the state. So I don't know how to work all that in, but I feel like that's really critically important.
Just to jump on that point, and Gary, you went to with the Maryland piece, our next slide, which we'll be discussing. You don't show the slide, Kelly. Our next, we're gonna get into what the recommendations we think should be. So I think that would be the issue around a 5-year period or a 2-year period where we review it constantly, like how Maryland does, which is where we're about to head to. Just to go back to the last point you made, I think for the interpretation, Kelly put into the chat that she is taking notes. And so I've heard from Chuck about the 75%, heard from Gary about getting clarity on this. One thing we could do is also ask the legal teams. So we could ask the ACLU what was meant by that, because if they're clear, then we can answer that question. If they're not, then we go back to, well, what does that mean? Tika put in the chat that she thinks it should be from outside of Delaware. Although we appreciate DSU, UD, WilmU, Goldie Beacom, I'm trying to think of all the colleges, universities here. Every group that is here might be good if somebody from outside to have the perspective. At the same time, we don't want it to be a cookie cutter. This is what we do for every state, and you need more research. So we'll put a next step to get the legal teams involved to answer that question. And my own hunch would be that independent means that Delaware as a state does not have financial influence over the institution as well. That is an assumption. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend like that's the legal review. So we'll have to find out from them.
Well, they will have a relationship with the state if they accept a contract.
Yeah, exactly.
Relationship. So how is that more or less independent?
And this is why I'm not a lawyer, and I'll defer to those legal teams. So if they come back and give us what that might be, then that might settle it. And to your point, Gary, if they do not have an answer, which they might not, then that is for us to wrestle with of what defines independent. Are there other points? And I do want to get to the next, we have to finish. We don't have to finalize this right now, but I did want to, because Gary got to the other point, not right now, and finish on this RFP conversation. I did want to also give time for what we think the funding should look like.
Aaron, can I just ask one question quick?
Sure.
Sorry, I'm the new kid on the work group. And so I went back to the settlement language just to make sure that I wasn't missing something. Is there any need for us to recommend or define what data they're looking at? Like, what is there a point in time? Is there a span of time when it comes to like not referendum, reassessments are going to start happening? So I wonder how that will impact what in 2024 they would find in terms of funding? Like, I'm wondering how the time is defined.
That
The
is
language in the settlement does not say anything about that.
correct. So this is where we get to make recommendations of what that should look like. The unit funding formula has been unchanged for a long time in Delaware. And so I guess the span would be the unit funding formula. But what do you recommend?
I don't know. I think that it's a terrible answer. I mean, since the last time it was, changed, that since what, the 50s, that feels like a long time to assess, but I don't know, that's probably the right answer, or an answer, I should say. I don't know if other people have.
So comparable, there's a research alliance that Shelley and Susan Bunting and our organizations are working on right now. And this state has really good data going back to the beginning of this century, really, and maybe not quite to the very beginning. Susan probably knows this is better than any of us, but in the first couple of years, 2006 or so, we've got really good data. And the data probably aren't exactly where we would like them to be for school level analysis, but they're better in the more recent years. So to go back much further than, say, 8 to 10 years would probably mean that the data sources are not as detailed and not as precise as they would be in the last 5 years or so. So I think we have to have data quality be a part of that discussion, because it would hamper the quality to go back I don't know, is it 80 years now since the funding formula was put into place? So or the unit system was put into place. So I think that should be part of the discussion.
I would also, just to tack on to my initial question about timeline or time frame, does the settlement money that has already been legislated, that has already been allocated, skew the data in any way when the independent assessment is being done? Like, do you want it done before the settlement was enacted? Any of the settlement were enacted?
I would think you would have to add in the funding increases from 2021 to 2025, especially with opportunity funding going up to $60 million, because that would be consistently moving forward. I do think, though, with those increases, one of the big questions from the intent of the settlement was, we need to build a system that works 30, 40, 50 years out. So $60 million in 75 years, what should that look like, and continue moving forward? And then, are we doing the right things? I don't think that we have those answers right now. So I do think, yes, include the additional funding that's come in to after the settlement, and look at the what else.
Awesome. And thank you, Chuck, for that.
Just prior to the settlement, there was a really important change in the opportunity funding being allocated based on students with greater needs and the weighting that was done there. And I think part of what it would be helpful to see is, did that move the needle? Because most of the assessments we have from the federal sources are prior to the opportunity funding and its allocation based on a weighted per pupil amount. And I think it would be important to know how much has the needle moved as a result of those changes, some of which were pre and some of which are with the settlement. In my view, would be the fair way to consider it at this point.
Yeah, absolutely agree. In the early days of our committee, we used to talk about cake and icing. and the opportunity fund and some of these additional units we're getting now is icing. And it's really, when you look percentage wise, it's a small percentage of that giant probably 1.8 trillion now, I don't know, massive state funding we receive. So it is a fair question to ask, is the icing moving the needle? And then I know that Dean Henry he modified our metaphor to, I think it's Dean Henry, to marble cake rather than just a plain old cake. Because of some of the different variations within the cake itself, within the state funding. So yeah, I think you have to look at it before and during the additional funding, because I mean, that's our reality now, and it's here to try to provide some equity. But again, I think it's like, I'm very thankful for the funding. It's not insignificant, but it is, relatively small compared to the entire mass of state funding we receive. Mhm.
Hi, I have a comment. May I make it? Do you mind, Aaron?
Is that Kristen?
Yes, it is.
I would love to hear you, Kristen.
How are you? So I was thinking a little bit about the discussion over the assessment itself. And I put in the chat that I agree with Dr. Henry. He and I are of the same mind that this can't be a one and done type of activity, and that it should exist on a cyclical basis here in Delaware to keep our system from falling into the position that it is now. And so thinking about it, I tried to, in a very short matter of time, tried to think about how would I address this if it were just up to me. And what I would consider, and maybe just food for thought tonight, maybe it'll go nowhere, I don't know, but the assessment is kind of the boilerplate instructions on where we stand now. What could happen legislatively is a companion piece to it that forms such a group that reviews it so that it is commissioned perhaps on a cyclical basis. And then you have a group that reviews it and then provides recommendations based kind of on that just ground level view that was provided by the assessment, as is required by the settlement. So, you know, put it into practice, this legislative session, you would potentially have you'd have a bill that would be written such that it charges a group to review the assessment and make further recommendations, and then, you know, fill in the middle however so you want. But I do think that this is, despite kind of the arguments about the details of what the assessment should look like or should entail, I think this is the first step in getting something in place. But the important part isn't necessarily, it's just one part, isn't necessarily the assessment itself, it's what is done with it and who's making the decisions based on the information that they receive. So I think that, you know, that's how I would, you know, if I were trying to think about ways to use the assessment and even just use it as like a boiler, like just, this is the basic stuff, ask for more information as you're reviewing it to really understand what it is you're looking for. You know, that's a legislative charge that potentially could happen. So I just wanted to, just because I was sitting here thinking about it, wanted to put it out there before it went out of my mind, because I have 2 screaming kids. So
I have a screaming dog happening soon. I think to marry what Kristen and Gary are both saying, you could also put into the RFP. So one suggestion might be to recommend best practices that could be used to monitor this on an annual basis or a period of time. So you can also include that in the RFP, that's part of recommendations, as well as the companion piece that Kristen's going to write and help us with that process too.
I would suggest we might consider the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Council model, because I think having something like that that has independence, but it's located in the state and has very nuanced knowledge of the state. But it's sort of out of the political push and shove, and they do the projections for the state revenues and expenditures that formulate the basis for the governor's budget, as I understand it. So I think the same sort of definition of independence and that same sort of model that's responsive to state needs and keeps the database and all those kind of things, so that each year you're not starting anew, or each 2 or 3 years you're not starting from scratch, but you're building on the knowledge and the data that you've assembled before. So that might be something that we want to. I'll put the website up in the chat.
I would push back just a wee bit on that, because I'm a member of DFAC and I think of myself as a bean counter. It's just you review what's going in, what's coming out. When it comes to the state revenues and expenditures, the concept I understand, and the similarities and how they could apply to what it is we're trying to do here. I think those are that it's an independent council. It meets regularly. It takes a look at what's being spent and how the money is coming in. Beyond that, I don't know what similarities would apply. I tend to look towards the language issued in the Maryland legislation in the early 2000s that commissioned the 10-year review. When you look at the Kerwin Commission, it did get a little bit beyond itself, but when you think about it, look at the major changes they just made in Maryland and how successful they were there. So if I were looking towards a model, I would do a scaled down version of the Kerwin Commission, but the bones based in the Maryland language.
Just for clarity, it sounds like we're getting into what we recommend, which would be the solutions. I would just pull back for the RFP would be looking at those processes that should be in place, because maybe there's something happening. So Maryland, definitely we're looking at that, and what Gary mentioned, but maybe something's Colorado is taking place. There's a new process we should put in place, but that's what the RFP should say. We want you looking at not just a one-stop answer, but also an ongoing process. Would that suffice for the RFP language, at least for Kristen and for Gary?
I think what I'm recommending is beyond the RFP. So I don't think it's appropriate for what I'm recommending to be placed in the RFP. I don't see the straight line there. This is kind of after the RFP, the assessment is done. What happens next?
Yeah, you're on my slide 12.
Sorry.
It's great to be ahead. Anybody else for this? And so the question I saw from Sarah, which is also getting that baseline data to inform what we're doing, and then also knowing the scope of when that's taking place. Anything else we'd like to add in? Because the next step, I know while you're thinking about this, I'm good with wait time, but the next step would be, we would take all these ideas, put this into the our RFP that we would be then saying, all right, our next meeting, we agree with this. We'll take other emails, go back and forth and revise it. And then for our next meeting, we'd love to have it be done. So you get to speak now, or you can email and add updates before our next meeting so we can make sure we have this thing finalized. And Kelly put into the chat, definitely you can email Kelly as we finalize our version of the RFP. And then our next step would be to send it to the Reading Consortium after we approve it. And then this will go on to Secretary Bunting and to DOE. Perfect. We can go to slide 12. Because this is what Kristen and Gary we're chomping at, of looking at what needs to take place. And so we thought that our group would love to focus on the RFP, but also have your own ideas ahead of time. So we even made a slide about it, and looking at discussing the current issues with the Delaware funding system. So part of it is just how we revise it and look at it over time has come up. Work group, the plan is to provide input by late winter, early spring. Chuck and I will tell you at our next meeting, the Chuck and Aaron plan, heavily Chuck, very little Aaron. So if you disagree with it, then you can blame Chuck. If you agree with it, then I was the first one to tell you about it. So that's called politics, people. So we'll get into that. But right now, if there are any other ideas, I've heard from Gary, heard from Kristen, any other ideas people have about the current Delaware funding system as we look to get to this later conversation in late winter, early spring around how to solve the funding, even before the RFP is done, even before the funding assessment is done. Oh, wow. We were jumping at answers earlier in the wrong slide, and now we're silent on the actual slide. I do think that I would love to see an increase in funding and support for our children. And I think right now we're seeing that. And just a personal thing, I know there's a lot of money in the state right now. And some of the money, I believe, is not being used to way to maximize the learning for children. So there's a lot of funding due to COVID, the pandemic, and we're excited about that. At the same time, I think there's some other areas that we could use that funding, which also leads to the Delaware funding structure of what we need to be doing moving forward for 10, 20, 30 years. If you guys think about this for a second, the unit funding formula started in the 1950s, 60s with very little changes. There's potential that whatever is changed in the next 2 years could be for the next 80 years in Delaware. We'll call it the Tika-Hartsock plan, and this is what they use forevermore. So hopefully not, because with the Maryland plan, we can make some changes, but just throwing that out there. Without hearing any plans, Tika, actually go ahead and 9:30 count. You hate it. That's as far as that conversation.
I don't necessarily have a solution right now, but particularly this year, it's horrible.
That's why we'll have the Tika-Hartsock plan in Delaware for the next 50 years, because you're going to solve that one. So we'll get into the issues and then we'll get into some solutions. Again, the timeline for this is late winter, early spring. So we're going to finish out the RFP for the independent funding assessment, and then we're going to be coming up with our own plans, because just as our conversation went on slide 11, you guys are already on slide 12, and we don't want to hold back this group. And maybe the independent assessment comes back that they like our plan, and that's what they recommend after we spend all this money to get it done by an independent group. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, so funding, I just want, folks to remember that funding also includes our capital program. So how we fund capital projects as well as how we fund minor cap projects, and to not lose sight of that, because I think changes can be made there as well.
Agreed. All right. With that, I was expecting a lot of fireworks tonight, and we're going to get into the trenches and argue about the entire funding system and also the RFP. But you guys are it's the first meeting, so that is.
I have one more while we're talking.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. I've talked to a few people that are on the call about my thoughts on how we should approach this. Because of the steps that have taken us to this point to get here, right? The infinite number of conversations that I've had around how we fund our education system, to the lawsuit, and the conversations we will continue to have. But the one thing that hasn't happened in all of this time, at least in the 10 years that I've been with DSCA, is the people that are the practitioners in the field, the parents of the children who attend, to the opinion makers kind of outside of the practitioners and the parents. We've never sat around the table and actually said, what is it that we want out of our funding system and how do we get there? Rather, we've said, here are all the issues with our current funding system. Here's a boilerplate plan that is used in almost every other state, and it's guaranteed to work here in Delaware. Why don't we just adopt it and plop it in and make tweaks here and there? But I've never been a part of a group that has said, this is what I want in a funding system. And here's a path to get there. And that's, not to belabor it, but that was the Kerwin Commission, right? And it basically outlined the plan of, this is what is mandated. These are our goals. This is what is needed. And they got to all three of those things. How do we fund what's been mandated? What are our needs? How do we project need? How do we continue to project need? Or how do we ascertain current need? And then what are our goals? Which I think the goals are always the toughest ones to have to argue back and forth. We've never done that. And maybe organizations that have opined on our funding system have, but I've been around and I've been a part of a lot of conversations. Those may have happened behind closed doors, but as an open and transparent process, I've never been a part of that conversation. It's always been exactly what your first bullet point is. What are the issues of the funding system? And we kind of start from a negative place rather than from a positive place. And while the Kerwin Commission may have ballooned, you had this amazing transformation happen in the way education is funded in Maryland. And so there's something to be said about that process. So I wanted to kind of put that out there, put it in the space. I'd rather have the conversation start from a positive place than what's wrong. We all know what's wrong. We've talked about what's wrong, so we're blue in the face. We have a lawsuit that has told us what is wrong. Now it's, how do we fix it? So I just wanted to put that.
I'm sorry, this is Shannon. So real quick, so I hate to put Bill on the spot, Bill Doolittle. But we tried to convene a group. I don't know, Bill, it may have been, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago now. I'm not sure. In any case, it included members from DSCA. We had, I know Tizzy Lockman was involved and a handful of other folks. And we talked about a structure and a framework around this funding piece. And I'm sure Bill probably will be able to dig out the document. And I mean, we did some extensive work. When I say we, Bill really did a lion's share of it. And we discussed in pretty detailed strategy around how the funding formula could be revised or improved. So I know, those conversations have been had, and I know that there's draft language out there that I don't know if Bill wouldn't mind even sharing around again. I think maybe worth revisiting. But again, I don't want to put Bill on the spot, although I just did. But Bill,
the actual final draft report was shared with the chairs of Reading, so they have it.
And then I'll just ask that if Bill, who's joining us tonight, if you could share that with Chuck and I, just a settlement committee, just so, since it's already been brought up and introduced, would love to just see that as well. And I also think we want to learn from what's already taken place. And Kristen, thank you for that healthy push, because I think that speaks to what Gary put in the chat of how do we envision a world where education actually works, where an achievement gap and an opportunity gap and a funding gap are no longer there, and what that means for children. And then how do we fund that accordingly, as opposed to deficit model thinking. So I think that's a healthy push. And I can also say what's working in education are all of you. So thank you to our settlement committee members, because you all have been literally trailblazing education. And I'm honored to even work with you all. So our future conversations, we're going to dig into this conversation and try to look at it from a strengths-based approach, and start having that conversation about goals and that push, as well as some shifts we want to make sure we can achieve those goals here in Delaware. An ABCD approach will be a step towards that too, to get put into the chat. And that is our upcoming conversation. So be prepared. The homework is going to be looking at the RFP. Please send any updates to Kelly. She put her email in the chat, but also we're going to be revising and sending out revisions to you all. 2 is think about the funding structure. just to pose that push, what does education look like when it works? And then how do we make sure we're meeting the needs of those, which does get to the current issues. Tika put in about 9:30, and I wrote her that this week has been the longest year ever. And it's also compounded dealing with the 30 count, but looking at how we can build the best state ever. That's our goal. So that's your homework. Solve all the problems in education. We appreciate you. We're going to jump into public comment, which means we're looking at Bill. If you want to say anything,
As always.
unless you want to sign up, Bill, and make it more formal, and or if you want to just go ahead.
I'm always happy to help. Listening through the conversation, obviously you all know that I've been working on funding for 15 years. I have to say, I agree that the Maryland model is a good starting point. We don't have to totally reinvent the wheel. We know that they were reasonably successful with the outcomes of that. The one big piece I did not see in the current draft, though I did not have it ahead of time to review, was there's no clear statement of that the study is going to include a full adequacy study. Part of what Shannon referred to was that group did an adequacy study to figure out how many dollars were actually needed to meet the needs of students. The state has never done one. It's way, way overdue. You can't talk about really solving the funding problem if you don't know what you need in dollars. So I would certainly, I think you're spinning your wheels if you don't include that in there. As the discussion of who should do the study, I personally would not have an over problem with one of our universities doing it, but I think they would have to set up a structure that had independent oversight to make sure there was no cross bias that occurred. And I think there might be some advantages to that. Quite honestly, having read all the prior studies done by independent consultants, to say they were poor would be an understatement. I mean, there were absolutely gross errors in almost every one of the studies done. And I think that in great part was because they never really understood our system and its history. So I think whatever we do, we need to keep the bias out of it. And that includes not having a commercial firm that's heavily invested in the NGA theory and model. So that's important. Let's see, what else do I have in my notes here? Also we need to really spend time on this RFP because quite honestly, most of these reports come out with such simplistic information that when you try to actually figure out what to do with it, it's not anywhere near deep enough to actually be useful when you're trying to get to the point where Kristen was talking about actually designing what should we do to make this work once we, know what our needs are and think we have some money. And I've said this before, but just as a point of reference, the settlement was great. I know the adequacy study we did, it only represented less than 20% of what's needed to meet the needs of children in poverty. I also wanted to correct a little bit, apologies. There's statements been made that our funding system has not changed since the 50s. That is actually not accurate. There was one major change made between 2000 and 2008. A needs-based funding system was overlaid onto our funding system. That represents now over $300 million of the education budget. So we have done this in a fashion before. We just haven't done it for all groups and equitably. So, I think, we need to keep an open mind about what works best. That's what I try to do as I'm looking through it and really say, it's not about what we think a system should be. It's what system best meets the needs of the kids and does that equitably and targets it appropriately. Let me see what else in my notes. I think that's the larger part of it. I just think that this is our one shot. If we mess it up again, we're not going to get another shot. So let's spend the time. Let's dig deep. Let's make sure it's truly a good analytical process. It puts out not just data, but data that's really, really useful for us. and useful for those of us who dig deep into it. Because every other study I have seen, it's been so superficial that it's really sad that the DOE spent the money on them. So.
Thank you, Bill. Anyone else for public comment? Perfect. So, Kelly, any next steps for us?
Our next two meetings are, we're proposing October 25th and November 22nd, 5 to 6:30. And we will follow up with any edits to the RFP and send that back out. If you have anything as well, please send it to me.
Perfect. So
That's
10,
all I have.
25, 11, 22, if there's any conflict there, please let us know. Just, we're looking to head back to Mondays. We know a lot of people are, Thursday's a heavy meeting day for a lot of different people. So that was the push for October 25 and 11/22, going back to that Monday structure, because no one likes to meet on Mondays except for us. All right. So if any conflicts there, definitely let us know. Everyone have a wonderful, wonderful week, a blessed Yom Kippur to those who are celebrating, and a happy Latinx Heritage Month kicking off this week. So excited. So have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
Good evening.
See you.